fact, it seems rather clear that Black Americans are doing better here today than they would be had their ancestors generations ago never been brought to these shores.
Is that the case? Are Black folks better off because our ancestors were brought here as slaves? The whole debate around reparations is hinged on the fact that a lot of people, and most of them are liberal, believe that Black folks need to be restored in some kind of way because of slavery. It doesn't take into account the fact that slavery was the norm going back in the Bible, because it was one of the ways that debts were paid. The only difference is that the American slavery was chattel slavery. So Matt Walsh talked about this. I came across this video that he did a few weeks ago. Now, I don't always agree with Matt Walsh. I respect his platform. I respect what he's doing. And when he is speaking about this, there are some points of disagreement that I have, but also some points where I would agree. Let's take a listen.
One argument against the reparations idea. There are many more and better ones. I've outlined most of them on the show at various points in the past. But today I'd like to talk about and call attention to a different argument against reparations, one that is, by our culture's standards, rather unspeakable, which doesn't mean that it's wrong. In fact, it normally means precisely the opposite. A guy named Wilford Riley, who's a college professor with a decent social media following, who also happens to be a Black man, made this point on Twitter yesterday. Here's what he tweeted. An awkward historical fact, which genuinely complicates the reparations debate, is that Black Americans are just obviously better off on average than we would have been had our ancestors never come to the United States.
Now, that argument is something that can't be validated. We don't know. We can't go back in time and change history. So making a statement like that is something that I can't agree with. Are Black people better off because they were brought here as slaves? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. They're better off because they were exposed to the gospel. They're better off because they were exposed to a true capitalistic system that was based on merit. Now, were they worse off because they were brought in the bottom of slave ships, in the bowels of slave ships? Of course not. Many people died. So to justify the fact that Black people today are better off totally ignores the human suffering that occurred to get to that point. See, that's not the case. That's like saying that because you made a sin and therefore you learn from that sin, you're better off for committing that sin. Or to put it a different way, because you made a mistake and you learn through that hardship, you're better off because you made that mistake. No, that's what people want to think, that they have to go through hardship, that they have to go through trials to be better off. You go through things in life, but it doesn't mean that you're better off. There are some people who are not better off because of things that have happened to them. They're worse off. So just to say that Black people today are better off because ancestors from a long time ago came over here and changed is not a good argument to make, in my opinion.
Pointing out something this self-evidently true isn't justifying slavery, which was obviously terrible for slaves and existed globally in 1850. But no one arguing for that $5 million today in LA is or has ever been a slave. Pro-POC affirmative action has been the law since '67.
And that is the point I want to make. No one today is a slave. No one today deserves reparations. If anything, you know what people tend to gloss over, and conservatives tend to do this, especially my white conservative brethren. I hate putting a qualifier in front of it, but I have to. They tend to, and the liberals do this too. They always have to go all the way back to slavery. The period that we really need to focus on is the period of Reconstruction. That's when a lot of the rights that were acquired and attained by Black people after the emancipation were stripped away. That's when we really need to hone in and focus on how can we repair the differences, the gaps that happened during that time. And I'm not talking about monetarily. I'm really talking about being intentional with our investments. And what he's talking about, affirmative action, all these government programs that were in place in the 50s and 60s and 70s as a result of LBJ and his New Deal have harmed the black community more than slavery ever did. And I always say that. The LBJ, Great Society program, has harmed black people more than anything that slavery did. Because you want to know why? Even during slavery, black folks still had agency. They still recognized, I may be in chains physically, but I'm not in chains spiritually. I'm not in chains emotionally. They're not going to get my soul. What these government programs have done has stripped the soul of black people out of them to the point where they're totally dependent upon the government. And that has made us weaker. That has emaciated the community to the point to where it is being destroyed. And the people in power know it, but they don't want to do anything about it. And that goes for the Democrats and Republicans. The only person that tried to do something as a president was Trump, and they kicked him out because they didn't want black people to achieve. And that is the truth. That is the truth. Trump tried to push opportunity zones with Tim Scott, and that was going to elevate opportunity in the black community. But these Republicans and these Democrats don't want that. They want to stay in power. And how do you stay in power? You have to have a class to rule over, and that's the poor, mostly black and brown people.
Now, he's not the first person to make this point. I remember hearing Dinesh D'Souza articulating the same point years and years ago. And the only thing that makes the point controversial is the insistence by disingenuous idiots to misconstrue it. They will say, as was referenced, that you're justifying slavery or defending it, perhaps even advocating for more of it. But that is obviously not the point. The point is that the push for reparations rests on the notion that black Americans are in a considerably worse spot today than they would have been had their ancestors never been brought here as slaves.
Black Americans are in a worse spot today than they were 50, 60, 70 years ago. And it's not because of slavery. And it's because of programs that have been instituted by the government. I'll even go back to FDR and the New Deal, welfare. When the government destroyed black families, that made the black community worse off than it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. It did, because black families were intact, communities were intact, they were working in unison, children were educated by people that really cared for them and wanted them to succeed. There was a genuine sense of camaraderie and family and community in black neighborhoods. All of that is gone because the government came in and they wanted to keep black people in bondage. And so you can't do it physically, so you do it economically. You do it emotionally. And that's what they did. So no, black people are worse off today than they were even 100 years ago. But it's not because of slavery. It's because of what happened as a result of Jim Crow and what has happened because of the government overcorrection, because you had socialists and Marxists in government who wanted to overcorrect because of the white guilt that they were feeling. And that has made the community worse off. Now, I don't believe black folks deserve reparations for that. I just want the government to get out of the community and provide opportunities for the community to thrive. That's what I want.
They say that we must repair this damage that black Americans are currently experiencing, they say, to the tune of $5 million or $7.5 million or maybe $75 million. Black Americans today are the furthest removed from that historic atrocity and yet should be paid the most in restitution for it. That's the claim. But this is a false notion. In fact, it seems rather clear that black Americans are doing better here today than they would be had their ancestors generations ago never been brought to these shores. We can prove this point by simply asking which African country anyone asking for reparations would prefer to live in. The answer, of course, is none of them.
And he could have made his argument without going there. Of course, black people in America are doing better than our counterparts in Africa, for the most part. But that's a false equivalency. You can't make that equivalent argument, and that's why I disagree with him. I wouldn't use that argument. I would say, are black people today better off than they were 60, 70, 80 years ago? And my answer is no, because our families are not intact. Babies are being born out of wedlock at an alarming rate. Young people are being killed in the streets by each other. You're dying off. We're struggling when it comes to education. We're not thriving when it comes to education. We are struggling when it comes to economic opportunity. Our families are being disintegrated. So no, black people are not better off today than they were 60, 70 years ago. And I'm talking about even the ones that lived in the Deep South during Jim Crow. And that's how bad it is today because of what the government has done to the black community. You think people living, I was just in New York for a few days. Drove past Bed-Stuy and some of the high-rise city living places. I want to call them something else, but the high-rise projects. You think people living in those projects are better off than people that had land and owned property in Mississippi back in the early 20s and 30s that actually had their own land and had their own house, that had agency? You think those people are better off? Why? Because they have more material things? No, I don't think so. Because unfortunately, more than likely, it's a single parent household, it's a black woman running that household, and the father's nowhere to be found. And she's working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. So you tell me who's better. You tell me what situation is better. Even with all the constant fear of living in the Deep South during the Jim Crow days, you tell me who's better off. I really want to hear in the comments. Tell me who's better off. So no, I will not make that argument. That's why I disagree with him on that. You can't make that argument. You can't. Because you know, another thing too, in Africa, yeah, they may not have all the materialistic things that people in America do, but their families are intact, especially in some of these countries that are really pushing for biblical values, Christian values. They're more intact than some of the Democratic politicians that black folks suck up to in America that are pushing all this destructive behavior, that are pushing all this destructive stuff in their community. So I disagree with that.
Now, you might offer the rebuttal that if slavery never existed, if we're reimagining history without that institution at all, then Africa itself would be in a better shape, better place, and better shape, and maybe indeed black Americans would be better off there. But this seems highly unlikely, and it also ignores the fact that Africans participated in slavery and the slave trade as much as they were victims of it.
That's true. They did. Because it was a worldwide practice.
Not to mention, if we're reimagining the world without African slavery, then we have to also imagine it without all other forms of global slavery, since African slavery was merely one variety, one offshoot of this global institution. And now we have totally, at that point, rewritten the history of the world in a way so dramatic that it's absolutely impossible to say which individuals today would end up worse or better in this alternate universe. I mean, if you go back in time and get rid of slavery from the entire world, you have it's impossible to say what the world looks like right now.
But that's where his argument falls apart, because there are different forms of slavery. Like I mentioned before, there was slavery because you had to pay off a debt. There were indentured servants who worked for a certain period of time in order to pay off a debt. And then there was chattel slavery. Chattel slavery sets apart the slavery here in America. Chattel slavery is when you take someone into slavery, you take ownership of them, not because they lost in a war and not because they pay off a debt. You're treating them like animals. Chattel. And that was the difference. So that's where I disagree with Matt Walsh. There is a difference between the type of slavery that occurred in the Americas and other European nations towards the end of that practice of slavery as we know it. So there is a difference between that. That stripped them of their history, that stripped them of all dignity. It did. And it set up a process that was only broken by the power of God. I think America, I think the nation would have been better if people truly believed God and operated out of a biblical principle instead of coming over here taking over people's lands. I believe that. I don't believe that was God's will for people to run across America and strip people of their land. That wasn't God's will. I'm sorry. I disagree. That was not manifest destiny. That was not God's will for you to do that. It was not.
Actually, what we can say is that we'd all end up worse. All of us today would be in a worse spot if slavery never existed at all across the entire globe.
I disagree with that. I totally disagree with that. How do you know that? Are you trying to say that the fruits of slavery have been so great that it were better off because we went through it? No, that's not the perfect will of God. That's the evil that exists within the heart of man to produce slavery. People are not better off because ancestors went through slavery. People are better off because of what was produced when the gospel, the good news, was allowed to spread across the world, namely into America, because it opened up freedom. It allowed people to treat each other as humans, to understand they were all created in the image of God, that they're human beings. That's when people were better off, not because of the practice of slavery.
Because a change that significant would likely shift the course of events in a way that would mean none of us would even exist. It would be a world full of other people who are not us. So I know that I benefit today from virtually everything my ancestors did and everything did to them, because if any of that had not happened, there's a very good chance that I never would have come into being. And as I see it, I benefit from being if the other option is not being. So where do we land after all of this? It's absurd. Once you get into this conversation of, well, let's get rid of this whole huge part of history and then try to figure out the equation of who's better off, it becomes immediately ridiculous. And what does that mean for the reparations discussion? Well, it means that the discussion is totally incoherent and stupid. It means that any reparations plan is an arbitrary policy resting on a whole series of totally unsupported and wildly speculative assumptions about the way things would be right now if they weren't the way that they actually are. And the best we can say about that assumption, the assumption that blacks in this country are worse off today because of slavery, is that it is a baseless theory. But what we can really say about it is that it's a dubious conclusion based on fanciful and pointless hypotheticals.
Are black people better off today because of slavery? The correct question to be asking, are black people better off today because of government programs? And the answer is a flat out no. It wasn't slavery that has contributed to the ills that we see in the black community. It is government programs and the destruction of the family unit and the unmooring of biblical values from the community that has placed it in the state that it is in today. Because they want us to be victims. We are not victims. We are empowered for greatness.